The clock struck 11. 34 inches the evening on that Saturday, the 20th of April, 1935, as Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson stepped out from the Red Rooster Bar located on 125th Street. 3 bodyguards accompanied him, men who had stayed by his side throughout the entire evening as he handled business matters with a variety of policy operators. At 30 years of age, Johnson had already carved out his position as one of the emerging criminal forces in Harlem, a man whose sharp mind and tactical approach had brought him both admiration and adversaries in equal proportion. The night had unfolded in typical fashion. There were card games, bourbon drinking, business conversations. Johnson sent his protection team away at the Red Rooster's entrance, informing them he would make the 50-foot walk to his Packard sedan by himself, something he frequently did. He felt certain that this particular section of 125th Street was his domain, convinced that nobody would have the audacity to confront him with ill intent on territory he controlled. What Johnson remained unaware of as he walked by himself toward his vehicle that April evening was the presence of someone lurking in the darkness, waiting precisely for this opportunity. The opportunity when Johnson's self-assurance rendered him exposed, when the individual who dominated a significant portion of Harlem moved without protection across 50 feet separating a doorway from an automobile. The person waiting was not among Dutch Schultz's white muscle. This was a black individual called Thomas "Tommy" Wright, 28 years of age, destitute and starving and desperate. An intermediary connected to Schultz had presented him with an offer of $1,000 to execute Bumpy Johnson. $1,000 that would sustain Wright's family half a year. $1,000 Wright required so urgently that he had consented to murdering someone he had never encountered and bore no grudge against. Based on accounts from 5 witnesses present on 125th Street that evening, individuals who provided statements to the Harlem Gazette between April 21st and April 23rd of 1935, the events that transpired during the following 5 minutes evolved into the most celebrated demonstration of Bumpy Johnson's brilliance for converting adversaries into companions, for comprehending human despair, for recognizing that allegiance could be purchased but required proper purchase, not via intimidation or force, rather through understanding people's genuine needs and fulfilling those needs in manners that converted business arrangements into fraternal bonds. Johnson stood roughly 10 feet distant from his automobile, his hand reaching into his pocket searching for his keys, when a voice from behind spoke quietly yet distinctly. "Don't move, Bumpy. I got a gun pointed at your back." Johnson became motionless, hands remaining in his pockets, then slowly rotated around, disregarding the command not to move. Every one of the 5 witnesses reported that Johnson's expression revealed no terror when he turned and observed the individual standing 15 feet away from him. Thomas Wright appeared visibly anxious, gripping a .38 caliber revolver aimed at Johnson's chest, his hand trembling somewhat, though stable enough to prove lethal at such range. The guy was clearly terrified, Marcus Williams recalls, 28 years old, positioned outside the Red Rooster, observing the complete confrontation. Williams provided his statement to the Gazette on April 22nd, 1935. His hand was shaking. He looked like he was about to throw up, yet he maintained the gun directed at Bumpy with his finger resting on the trigger. Everyone observing comprehended the situation. We were witnessing an assassination in motion. Some white criminal organization figure, likely Dutch Schultz, had recruited a desperate black individual to eliminate Bumpy Johnson. The desperate black individual had successfully gained the advantage on Bumpy, held him at gunpoint without any defense, standing perhaps 2 seconds from squeezing the trigger and claiming whatever payment had been guaranteed. Johnson and Wright locked eyes in silence for roughly 5 seconds. Then Johnson performed an action that astonished everyone watching. He produced a slight smile, withdrew his hands gradually from his pockets, demonstrating their emptiness, and posed a question that would transform into the most celebrated 6 words ever uttered on a Harlem street corner. "How much are you being paid?" Wright wavered, his weapon still directed at Johnson's chest, confusion apparent on his expression. because this scenario differed from his expectations. The individual he was meant to execute was inquiring about his payment rather than pleading for mercy or attempting escape or reaching for his own firearm. $1,000, Wright stammered based on witnesses who clearly heard the conversation. They're paying me $1,000 to kill you. Johnson responded with a slow nod as though carefully contemplating this detail. Then his expression transformed into a broader smile, not ridiculing or vicious, but authentically impressed, according to witnesses observing his face. $1,000, Johnson echoed. They're paying you $1,000 to kill Bumpy Johnson. That's insulting to both of us, brother. Insulting to me because my life carries far greater worth than $1,000. And insulting to you because you're placing your life and your soul at risk for $1,000 when your capabilities hold substantially more value than that to the proper employer. Johnson paused, allowing that declaration to settle, then voiced the statement that transformed everything. I'll pay you $5,000 if you join my crew right now, tonight. Put the gun down and work for me instead of killing me. Based on every witness account, Wright's expression displayed complete astonishment. His weapon wavered, the barrel lowering slightly as his arm weakened from the shock of what he had just heard. Schultz wants a black man to kill a black man? Johnson proceeded, his tone remaining calm and conversational, as though he were not positioned 15 feet from a loaded firearm. That's not happening. Not tonight, not ever. So, here's what's going to happen instead. You're going to put that gun down. You're going to take $5,000 from me. And tomorrow morning, you're going to meet me at this exact spot, and we're going to have a conversation about why you needed $1,000 desperately enough to consent to murdering a stranger, and then you're going to work for me. Does that sound like a superior arrangement than shooting me and collecting $1,000 from whoever recruited you? Wright remained frozen, his weapon now aimed at the pavement, his mouth opening and shutting without producing words, clearly incapable of processing the situation. At that instant, Johnson's 3 protection personnel, William Bub Hewlett, Samuel Big Sam Jackson, and Marcus Quick Davis, emerged rapidly from the Red Rooster, where they had been positioned just inside the entrance. All 3 brandished weapons pointed at Wright within seconds, encircling him from 3 angles, prepared to discharge the moment Johnson issued the command. "We got him, boss," Hewlett announced. "Drop the gun, or you're dead." However, Johnson raised his hand, halting his protection team before they could shoot Wright or forcibly disarm him. "Drop your weapons," Johnson stated calmly to his own protection detail. "This man isn't a threat. He's a businessman who's about to change employers. Drop your weapons now." The 3 bodyguards observed Johnson with confusion, their firearms still aimed at Wright. "Boss, this man just tried to kill you," Jackson objected. "We got him dead to rights. Let us handle this." I said. "Drop your weapons," Johnson repeated, his tone still calm, though now bearing an edge of authority that clarified this was not a recommendation. "And somebody give me $5,000 cash right now." The protection team gradually lowered their firearms, still bewildered, still monitoring Wright cautiously in case he attempted something. Hewlett reached inside his jacket and extracted a substantial envelope, currency that had been gathered from various policy operations earlier that evening, intended for delivery to Johnson's office for tallying and allocation. Hewlett counted out $5,000, hands operating automatically, while his mind attempted to comprehend why his employer was preparing to give a fortune to the individual who had just attempted to murder him. Johnson accepted the currency from Hewlett, proceeded slowly toward Wright, who stood immobilized, unable to determine whether to raise his weapon again or flee or simply capitulate, and offered the cash toward him. "Take it," Johnson said quietly. "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock, right here, you and me, we talk. You tell me your story. I decide whether you work for me or not, but either way, you keep this $5,000. Consider it payment for not pulling that trigger tonight. Consider it an investment in your future. Consider it proof that working with me pays better than working against me. Take the money and go home. Take care of whatever problem you've got that made you desperate enough to agree to kill someone, and tomorrow we talk about whether you've got what it takes to work in my organization." Wright gradually reached forward and accepted the envelope of currency, his hand trembling so intensely now that he nearly let it fall. He observed the three protection personnel who were watching with expressions hovering between confusion and fury, looked back at Johnson. "Thank you," Wright whispered, tears starting to flow down his face. "Thank you. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I needed... Thank you." "Tomorrow," Johnson stated simply, 9 a.m. Don't be late. Now go home." Wright retreated slowly, still clutching the weapon in one hand and the envelope of currency in the other, unable to accept what had just occurred, unable to comprehend that the individual he had been dispatched to eliminate had instead provided him 5 times the payment he had been guaranteed for committing murder. When Wright stood roughly 20 feet distant, he turned and sprinted, vanishing into the darkness of Harlem's streets, while Johnson and his 3 astonished protection personnel observed his departure. The automobile ride home. "He's brave, he needs money, and he follows orders." Based on William Hewlett's account, who provided his statement to the Gazette on April 23, 1935, the automobile ride returning to Johnson's residence that evening constituted one of the most peculiar conversations he had ever experienced with his employer. The 3 protection personnel were enraged with themselves for permitting someone to approach so closely to Johnson with a firearm, bewildered regarding why Johnson had compensated the would-be murderer instead of having him eliminated, and concerned that Johnson had committed a grave error that would cost him his existence when Wright returned the following morning to complete what he had initiated. "We were all talking at once," Hewlett recounts. "Sam was saying we should go find the guy and take the money back and kill him before he could tell whoever hired him that the hit had failed. Quick was saying we'd failed at our jobs by letting someone get close enough to point a gun at Bumpy. I was saying I didn't understand why Bumpy had given $5,000 to someone who'd been hired to kill him. We were all upset and confused and trying to figure out what had just happened." Johnson sat quietly in the rear seat of the Packard while his protection personnel drove and argued, permitting them to express their frustration and bewilderment for several minutes before finally interrupting them with a solitary statement that, according to Hewlett, completely altered how all 3 protection personnel comprehended what had transpired on 125th Street. "He's a brave man. He needs money, and he follows orders without caring who gives them. Those are exactly the qualities I look for in people I employ. Now I want him in my crew." The automobile went silent as the 3 protection personnel processed what Johnson had articulated. "And every time I look at him," Johnson proceeded, "I'll remember how close to death he got me tonight. I'll remember that I need to improve my security, that I can't walk alone, even 50 feet, on my own territory, that there are desperate men out there who will kill for $1,000, no matter how much power I have or how much territory I control. That man taught me a valuable lesson tonight. He reminded me that I'm not invincible. That's worth $5,000. Based on Hewlett's account, this explanation astounded all 3 protection personnel because it exposed how Johnson contemplated threats regarding loyalty, regarding the merit of converting adversaries into companions rather than merely eliminating adversaries. "Bumpy saw something in that desperate guy with the shaking gun that we didn't see," Hewlett explains. "We saw a threat that needed to be eliminated. Bumpy saw a man who was brave enough to approach him with a weapon, desperate enough to accept a murder contract for only $1,000, and obedient enough to follow orders from strangers. Bumpy understood that those qualities made the guy potentially valuable, more valuable alive and working for us than dead. And Bumpy understood that paying him $5,000 instead of the $1,000 he'd been promised would create intense loyalty because the guy would understand that Bumpy valued him more than whoever had hired him to commit murder. It was brilliant psychology. Bumpy turned a threat into an asset, turned a man who was trying to kill him into a man who would die for him, all because Bumpy understood what the guy really needed and was willing to provide it in a way that transformed their relationship from enemies to allies. Sunday morning, April 21st, 1935. I have a daughter and a son who don't have food. At 8:55 in the morning on Sunday, April 21st, 1935, Thomas Wright materialized outside the Red Rooster Bar on 125th Street, 5 minutes ahead of schedule for his 9 o'clock meeting with Bumpy Johnson. Wright had shaved cleanly, wearing his finest suit, threadbare yet pressed, and holding the envelope containing the $5,000 Johnson had provided him the previous evening. Wright appeared anxious yet resolute, like an individual who comprehended he had been granted an extraordinary opportunity and who was terrified of performing any action that might result in losing it. Johnson arrived precisely at 900 hours, again accompanied by his 3 protection personnel who positioned themselves in proximity, though who provided Johnson and Wright space to converse privately. Johnson shook Wright's hand, a gesture that clearly startled Wright, who had anticipated something more ceremonial or distant, then recommended they walk together along 125th Street while they conversed. Based on Houlette's account, who walked behind Johnson and Wright at a distance of roughly 20 feet and who could hear portions of their conversation, Wright commenced explaining his circumstances immediately. My name is Thomas Wright. I'm 28 years old. I've lived in Harlem my whole life. I've worked every legitimate job I could find. Porter, janitor, construction laborer, when construction was available, anything that would pay money. But in April 1935 inches, Harlem, there aren't any jobs. The Depression has destroyed everything. White people won't hire black men for anything except the very worst jobs at the very lowest pay, and even those jobs are impossible to get because 100 men apply for every position that opens up. Wright paused, his voice fracturing slightly, then proceeded based on Houlette's recollection. I have a daughter who's 7 years old and a son who's 5 years old. They haven't had a proper meal in 3 weeks. We're eating bread and water because that's all I can afford. My wife is sick. She has pneumonia. She needs medicine that costs $40. And I don't have $40. I don't have $10. I don't have $1. I've sold everything we own that has any value. I've borrowed money from everyone who would lend to me. I've begged for work everywhere that might hire me. And I've failed. I am failing as a father and as a husband because I can't feed my children or get medicine for my wife. Based on Houlette's observation, Wright was weeping openly at this juncture, though continued speaking through his tears. 3 days ago, a man I don't know approached me on the street. He said he'd heard I needed money. He said he had a job that would pay $1,000. He said the job was simple: kill Bumpy Johnson. I asked who was paying for the hit. He said it didn't matter who was paying, just that the money was guaranteed if I completed the job. I asked why they wanted you dead. He said it didn't matter why, just that you needed to be dead, and they'd pay $1,000 to whoever made that happen. Wright wiped his eyes and looked directly at Johnson, based on Houlette's description. I want you to understand something, Mr. Johnson. I don't know Dutch Schultz. I've never met him. I don't work for him. I don't know anything about policy gambling or territory disputes or criminal organizations. I'm not a criminal. I'm just a desperate man who needs money to feed his children and get medicine for his wife. The man who approached me might work for Schultz, or he might work for someone else entirely. I don't know, and I didn't ask. All I knew was that $1,000 would solve my immediate problems, would feed my family for 6 months, would get medicine for my wife. So I said yes. I said I'd kill a man I'd never met because I needed the money badly enough that I'd do anything to get it. Johnson listened to all of this in silence, based on Houlette's account, his expression revealing no emotion until Wright completed speaking. Then Johnson ceased walking, rotated to face Wright directly, and offered his hand for Wright to shake. From now on, you work for me and not anybody else. Johnson articulated clearly enough that Houlette heard every syllable. Not Dutch Schultz, not whoever approached you 3 days ago, not any other criminal organization in Harlem or anywhere else. You work for me exclusively. You follow my orders. You do what I tell you to do. You're loyal to me and to this organization. And in exchange, I pay you better than anyone else would pay you. I make sure your family has food and medicine and everything else they need. And I give you work that has meaning beyond just collecting a paycheck. Do you hear me? Do you understand what I'm offering you and what I'm demanding from you? Based on Houlette's observation, Wright commenced weeping again. Not from despair this occasion, but from relief and appreciation. Wright seized Johnson's hand with both of his hands, shaking it energetically, while tears flowed down his face. I understand, Mr. Johnson. I swear to you, I'll be loyal. I'll work harder than anyone you've ever employed. I'll do whatever you need me to do. I'll prove that you made the right decision, giving me this chance. Thank you. Thank you for not killing me last night when you had every right to kill me. Thank you for giving me money I didn't deserve. Thank you for offering me work when I'd come to kill you. Thank you for understanding why I did what I did. I won't forget this. I'll spend the rest of my life proving I deserved your mercy and your generosity. Johnson nodded, withdrew his hand gently from Wright's grasp, then placed his hand on Wright's shoulder in a gesture that Houlette characterizes as almost paternal. Go home, Johnson stated. Take care of your wife, feed your children, use that $5,000 to solve your immediate problems. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., you report to William Houlette. That's him standing 20 feet behind us, watching this conversation. Houlette will give you your first assignments. You'll start as a collector, walking routes and picking up policy money from our runners. It's simple work, but it's important work, and it pays $40 per week, which is more than you'd earn doing almost any legitimate job available to black men in 1935. You do that work well, you'll get more responsibility and more money. You prove yourself valuable, you'll move up in the organization. You prove yourself loyal, you'll have a job for as long as you want one. Understand? I understand, Mr. Johnson, Wright responded, still weeping. Thank you. I'll prove myself. I promise. Johnson nodded once more, then rotated and proceeded back toward his automobile, while Wright remained motionless on 125th Street, observing the individual whose existence he had been compensated to terminate. The individual who had instead provided him currency and employment and hope. The individual who had seen past the weapon and the assassination contract to comprehend the desperation and the necessity that had generated both. Thomas Tommy Wright performed services for Bumpy Johnson from April 1935 until Wright's passing from a cardiac arrest in 1962. 27 years during which Wright transformed into one of Johnson's most trusted associates, eventually managing substantial portions of Johnson's policy operations and earning recognition as someone whose allegiance was absolute because he never forgot the evening Bumpy Johnson could have eliminated him, but instead provided him $5,000 and employment. Tommy Wright became one of Bumpy's key people. Theodore Green states, Johnson's legal counsel, who provided his statement to the Gazette on April 23, 1935. Bumpy trusted Wright with important responsibilities, managing collections, supervising runners, handling money, negotiating with other operators. Wright proved his loyalty repeatedly over 27 years, and Bumpy rewarded that loyalty with increasing responsibility and increasing pay. By the 1,950 seconds, Wright was earning more than most legitimate businessmen in Harlem, and he was doing work that he believed in because Bumpy had taught him that there was meaning in standing with your own people rather than betraying them for whoever offered the most money. However, Wright's transformation from would-be murderer to faithful lieutenant possessed significance, extending beyond his individual narrative. Wright became living verification of Johnson's philosophy regarding loyalty, regarding comprehending what people required, regarding the merit of mercy and tactical generosity over immediate brutality. Everyone in Bumpy's organization knew the story of Tommy Wright and the gun he didn't fire, Houlette states. Bumpy made sure everyone knew it because the story illustrated important lessons. That loyalty can be bought if you buy it properly. That understanding what people need gives you power over them in ways that fear never provides. That mercy can be more strategic than violence when mercy transforms enemies into allies. New recruits to Bumpy's organization were informed about Tommy Wright, were instructed to notice that one of Bumpy's top lieutenants was an individual who had once been recruited to eliminate Bumpy, but who had instead transformed into his most faithful soldier, because Bumpy had comprehended what Wright required and had supplied it in manners that created a connection stronger than currency could generate by itself. Wright reportedly preserved the .38 caliber revolver he had aimed at Johnson on April 20th, 1935, exhibited in his residence as a reminder of the evening his existence transformed. The evening he had been prepared to commit murder for $1,000 and had instead received $5,000 and mercy and opportunity from the individual he had been dispatched to eliminate. Wright would present the weapon to his children and subsequently to his grandchildren, recounting to them about Bumpy Johnson's intelligence and generosity and tactical brilliance, instructing them that sometimes mercy proves more powerful than brutality, and that comprehending what people require holds greater value than knowing how to harm them. The question that became legend: how much are you being paid? The 6 words Bumpy Johnson articulated to Thomas Wright on April 20th, 1935, how much are you being paid, transformed into the most celebrated question ever posed on a Harlem street corner. Witnesses who heard the question repeated it to others who repeated it to others, dispersing throughout Harlem during the spring and summer of 1935, until everyone in Harlem's criminal underworld knew the narrative of the individual who had been recruited to eliminate Bumpy Johnson for $1,000, and who had been recruited instead by Bumpy Johnson for $5,000 because Johnson comprehended that allegiance could be acquired but required proper acquisition. What made that question so brilliant was how it reframed everything, Green states. Wright had a gun pointed at Bumpy. Wright held all the power in that moment. He could kill Bumpy and collect his money, or he could spare Bumpy for reasons of mercy or fear. But the instant Bumpy asked, "How much are you being paid?" the power dynamic shifted completely. Suddenly, it wasn't about whether Wright would kill Bumpy. It was about whether Wright was being paid enough to kill Bumpy, whether the compensation matched the task, whether Wright was being valued properly by his employer. That question made Wright think about his situation differently, made him realize he was being underpaid for the risk he was taking and the act he was committing. And once Wright admitted he was only getting $1,000, Bumpy could offer more and could make Wright understand that working for Bumpy was a better deal than killing Bumpy. The narrative of Johnson's question and his $5,000 proposition transformed into required education for criminals throughout Harlem. Policy operators who competed with Johnson for territory discovered that attempting to recruit assassins to eliminate Johnson proved pointless because Johnson could exceed their bids and convert their assassins into his personnel. Young criminals who desired to participate in organized crime discovered that Bumpy Johnson compensated superior to other employers and that allegiance to Johnson signified allegiance for existence because Johnson never forgot who had supported him and who had opposed him. That question, "How much are you being paid?" transformed into shorthand for an entire philosophy regarding loyalty and employment and comprehending what motivates people. Reverend James Thompson states, 58 years old, a Harlem minister who knew Johnson and who provided his statement to the Gazette on April 22, 1935. Bumpy understood that most people aren't evil, they're desperate. Most people don't want to hurt others. They want to survive and provide for their families. If you understand that desperation, if you understand what people really need beyond just money, you can turn enemies into allies by providing what they need in ways that create bonds stronger than fear or coercion could ever create. That was Bumpy's genius. He understood human nature better than most criminals understood it. And he used that understanding to build an organization where people were loyal, not just because they were afraid of Bumpy, but because they genuinely believed Bumpy cared about them and would take care of them if they took care of him. The lesson for Bumpy's security. I was one step away from being dead. Johnson's close encounter with mortality on April 20th, 1935, transformed how he contemplated security for the remainder of his existence. Based on multiple associates' accounts, Johnson never again proceeded alone. Even brief distances on Harlem streets, never dismissed his protection personnel casually, never presumed that his reputation or his authority rendered him invulnerable to assassination attempts by desperate individuals who required currency urgently enough to risk attacking someone more powerful than themselves. After Tommy Wright, Bumpy took security much more seriously, Hewlett states. Bumpy realized that all the power in the world doesn't protect you from a desperate man with a gun if you make yourself vulnerable even for 50 feet between a doorway and a car. Bumpy upgraded his security. More bodyguards, better planning, less predictable patterns. And Bumpy kept Tommy Wright close, partly because looking at Wright reminded Bumpy every day that he'd been one step away from being dead. That he'd gotten lucky when Wright hesitated long enough for Bumpy to ask his question. That luck runs out eventually if you rely on it too often. Wright transformed into a living reminder to Bumpy and to everyone in Bumpy's organization that you're never safe, never invincible, never beyond the reach of violence, no matter how powerful you become. Dutch Schultz's reaction to discovering that his $1,000 assassin had instead been recruited by Bumpy Johnson for $5,000 reportedly constituted a combination of fury and reluctant admiration. Based on sources present when Schultz discovered what had transpired, Schultz was enraged that his assassination had failed. Though impressed by Johnson's tactical thinking in recognizing that compensating more than the assassination contract was valued transformed an adversary into a companion, Schultz understood he'd been outmaneuvered. Detective Raymond Murphy of the New York Police Department states, who investigated organized crime in Harlem and who provided his statement to the Gazette on April 24, 1935. Schultz had attempted to utilize the most economical possible method to eliminate Johnson, recruiting a desperate individual for minimal currency and hoping desperation would prove sufficient motivation for murder. But Bumpy understood that desperation cuts both ways, that desperate men are loyal to whoever pays them best rather than to whoever hires them first. By offering 5 times what Schultz was compensating, Bumpy converted Schultz's assassin into his own personnel and transmitted a message to every other potential assassin. Killing Bumpy Johnson pays less than working for Bumpy Johnson. That message made it substantially more difficult for Schultz to recruit reliable people to operate against Johnson's interests. Schultz reportedly never attempted another assassination contract against Johnson following the Tommy Wright failure. By October 1935, 6 months following Wright's unsuccessful assassination, Schultz was deceased, eliminated by contract killers operating for Lucky Luciano and the Commission, removing the primary threat to Harlem's independent policy operators and permitting Johnson to consolidate his authority over territories Schultz had been attempting to capture. In Harlem, presently, elderly residents who recall the 1,930 seconds still recount the narrative of the evening. Bumpy Johnson confronted a would-be assassin by posing one simple question regarding currency, then converted that assassin into one of his most faithful soldiers by compensating more than the assassination contract was valued. The narrative has been recounted and retold for decades, transforming into legend, transforming into myth, transforming into the definitive illustration of Bumpy Johnson's intelligence and his comprehension, that loyalty holds greater value than brutality when you know how to generate it properly. The question, "How much are you being paid?" transformed into the most celebrated 6 words Bumpy Johnson ever articulated. More enduring than any threats he issued to competitors, more memorable than any boasts regarding wealth or authority, more influential than any commands he provided to his organization, because those 6 words demonstrated something fundamental regarding intelligence and strategy that most criminals never comprehended, that comprehending what motivates people, supplying what they require in manners that generate connections of loyalty, converting adversaries into companions through tactical generosity, rather than eliminating adversaries through immediate brutality, these capabilities rendered you more powerful than firearms or terror could render you, more secure than protection personnel could render you, more successful than savagery could render you. Thomas Wright existed for 27 years following aiming a weapon at Bumpy Johnson on April 20th, 1935. He raised his children, cared for his wife, earned good money performing labor that provided him dignity, and never forgot the evening an individual whose existence he had been compensated to terminate instead provided him currency and mercy and opportunity. And Bumpy Johnson existed for 33 more years, following confronting mortality at Thomas Wright's hands, constructing an empire that endured decades, transforming into the most powerful and most respected criminal in Harlem's history, never forgetting the lesson Wright instructed him that you're never invincible, never beyond the reach of desperate individuals with firearms, never safe unless you comprehend that security originates not merely from protection personnel and weapons, but from comprehending human nature sufficiently well to convert would-be executioners into brothers. That constituted the significance of April 20th, 1935. That constituted the lesson of 6 words that transformed Harlem permanently. That constituted the question that prevented a bullet and initiated a legend regarding mercy, proving more tactical than murder, when you comprehend what people require and supply it in manners that transform adversaries into family.